And we're back for another episode of CantoSense. We're embracing Chinese culture for Christian living. We're here to talk about food and how it's such a big part of Chinese culture. Now, food is a big part of many cultures, but in the case of Chinese culture and maybe even a lot of other Eastern cultures, the communal aspect of food is quite unique, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because this really came home for me recently when my son was doing a project for school to do a comparison of food in the West and food in the East. When you eat Western food, when you go to a French restaurant or Italian restaurant, of course, we share the appetizer, but your main meal, your main dish, your entree is your own, right? I mean, everything that you eat, this is my plate. So I order what I want.
So even in Western restaurants, when you go in, everyone's reading their menu. There might be someone who will say, "Hey, are we sharing?" And you
Yes,
need to ask that because if you don't ask, it's assumed that everyone's just going to order their own thing.
exactly. For Chinese meal, typically you will have your own bowl of rice and the main dishes are shared.
What do Chinese people hope to achieve with this? Is there sort of a reason why they do this or a goal in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's undergirded by a few values, again, that we hold close. When you look at the Chinese culture, it is a much more collective culture in
Mm,
comparison to, for example, the West. And that's why
right.
it's amazing how it's reflected in our food. You see that even in the shape of the dining table in a lot of Chinese homes. Of course, nowadays we have tables that are rectangular or square, but if you go to a really Chinese house, the dining table is typically circular because everyone can sit around it and share because the shared food is in the center. And of course, we all know that the dining table is center of family life in a lot of Chinese homes. Eating together is the value of respect for elders. I don't know if you do it in your family. Growing up when I was a kid, when it's mealtime, everybody would sit around the table. Before we eat, we have to greet everyone. So, for example, just before we eat, we will say "婆婆食飯," basically greeting my grandmother, or "阿爸食飯,阿媽食飯,阿姨食飯." So, depending on how many people who are older than you around the table, you have to call all their names before you actually start eating, which of course can be a challenge during Chinese New Year sometimes because you have relatives who join you and you don't know how to call them because in Chinese, there are all these different
Right.
labels that you give your
Right.
relatives, cousins and uncles, right? So there's this ritual of greeting elders before you eat. That is really an expression of the value of respecting your
Mm,
elders. And at the same time is also giving them the honor to let them take first dibs,
mm.
when you say "婆婆食飯," grandma, let's have dinner. You are just saying, please have the drumstick first. Of course, Chinese people prefer dark meat than white
Or the
meat.
or the cheek of the steamed fish.
Yes. So you are inviting them to take the best parts because you want to honor them. Ultimately, eating together is meant to build relationship, where we preserve or maintain harmony of our relationship with family members.
But does that really happen? I mean, I understand the intention for harmony, but I've been to dinners with, my extended family where there's a lot of people there. And then I've been to the homes of my Chinese friends. And sometimes people just don't talk and they're just there to eat. And then after that, everyone goes home. So if we're there for the harmony of relationships, but we don't talk to each other, there's no relational element. I really got to ask, what's really being achieved here? Or are we just going through the motions? Or there's unspoken conflict that people don't want to deal with that's age old, like I guess I'm just really trying to get to the heart of this and say, how much of it really does take place.
No, you said it. Every ritual, when you do it devoid of the meaning or the value, would become very legalistic. So just because we've sat around the table and we've greeted each other, or we've allowed the other person to take first dibs, does not necessarily mean that what you are trying to achieve through the ritual has been achieved, right? But this is where redeeming it is very important.
Mm,
How can we redeem this for Christ?
It really reminds me of the love feast or agape feast of the early church,
hmm,
where early Christians would come together and they would have communion. We talked about that in the
mhm.
last episode. And they would have a meal together. They would remember the sacrifice of Christ. They would fellowship. And of course, we have to remember the early church was going through a lot of persecution as well. There was real authenticity in their relationship. I mean, I'm sure there were disagreements as well.
Sure.
Read that in the book of Acts. Nonetheless, when they got together, there was a sense of forgiveness. When you remember what Christ has done on the cross,
Mm.
bringing restoration and reconciliation, you cannot help but feel like, if Christ has forgiven me for
Right.
who I am, what I've done, I've got to forgive my brother. So I think this love feast of the early church it's a real example that we can model our ritual of eating together, where we can exemplify authenticity in our relationship and build relationship.
It's a pretty high bar, though, I gotta say,
Absolutely.
especially in Eastern cultures. I don't want to say just Chinese, because I know a lot of Eastern cultures are like this too. We're non-confrontational. We don't want to deal with conflict. We don't want to unearth things. So while it is a great example, I gotta say it's a tall order. um,
Yeah, no, you're right. But bear in mind, the culture of the early church too was very much honor shame culture.
yeah,
But they
yeah.
were able to rise above that
Mm.
and recognize that if this is the right thing to do, there's a place to do it properly and rightly.
So looking at the early church and then bringing this back to family gatherings, there's more onus on me as a believer to bring those genuine interactions to the table. If they don't currently exist, then why aren't I doing something about it? Why don't I engage in conversation? Why don't I ask my aunt about her recent vacation? I think a lot of the times we stay silent because it's safer to be passive. It might be less awkward. And I'm speaking as a kid, because being unmarried, relatives often see you as a kid because I'll show up with my parents, but I'm not a kid anymore. And I think as an adult we can own up to our role to play.
When we think of the word ritual, we think of traditions and big things that we
Yeah.
do, but rituals are really spiritual disciplines that we practice.
Hmm.
So I want to bring it back to just our everyday life. This ritual of greeting elders before meals, I
Hmm.
think it's a great ritual, but we
Hmm.
have to do it right with intention. And at the same time, I would encourage all our viewers to perhaps redeem these rituals or develop these rituals. For example, one of the things I would love to do and build into my family meal ritual is that when we sit down, of course, give thanks to the Lord. But on top of that, to really be intentional in being humble, putting aside our pride. And if harsh words were said during the day, it is time to just say, I'm sorry.
Hmm.
And it is time to seek forgiveness,
Hmm.
or it is time to just be reconciled, a time of grace.
Hmm.
So I think these are some everyday rituals that we can practice.
Hmm.
Again, it's not easy. The toughest people for us to be gracious to is our family members.
If coming around the dinner table can mean that you're really brought together, not because of the food, but because you're really brought together, that would be very God honoring.
Real harmony and not
Yes,
surface or fake harmony.
that's right. Well, lots of great challenges for us. If you have experiences to share, we would love to hear them. Follow us on social media, subscribe to our channel, and we look forward to seeing you next time on CantoSense. God
Bye.
bless.